Hey guys, what's up? It's Collegio. Hope you're well. I had a couple of emails and texts, people asking me, hey, can you explain what's going on with Elon Musk and DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency? Um, so I thought I'd give you my take on that. I believe that what's going on between Trump and Musk with DOGE is actually very innovative. I think it's novel. And I think that they're going about cutting waste, fraud, and abuse in federal spending generally in a way that hasn't really been done before. Periodically, Republicans and Democrats get into these fights over government spending. Republicans will wake up one day and they'll say, "Oh, we need to be more fiscally responsible." Usually, when they're out of power, they do that, right? And Democrats fight back because they want to make sure that that the priorities that they've been setting forward in laws and appropriations in the past continue to get fulfilled, specifically with regard to programs for economically disadvantaged seniors, healthcare, education, those types of things. So usually what happens is the Republicans will come out and say, we need to be fiscally responsible. And American people say, yeah, that sounds good. And we need to cut federal spending. And people say, yeah, that sounds good. And then what happens is the concrete proposals of those spending cuts get released in committee. And suddenly, instead of abstractly talking about excessive government spending or government waste, the debate ends up focusing on the relevance or the value of these specific programs that are going to be cut. So you'll hear like, oh, we're going to cut $100 million from the Department of Commerce, and no one knows what the Department of Commerce is. And they say, great. And then the proposal comes out, and they're actually cutting $50 million from the National Weather Service or some satellite administration. And then the Democrats start saying, well, the TV stations aren't going to be able to give the weather anymore because you're cutting the National Weather Service. That's not a good idea. And then all of a sudden, these talks deteriorate, and then the Republicans usually run away with the tail between their legs because they can't sustain the criticism that they set up for themselves by actually cutting these agencies. That's not necessarily what the Republicans often want to do. They want to run the agencies. They would just like to do it more efficiently. But what ends up happening is it ends up becoming a debate over the merits of the agency itself. And the Republicans always lose this debate, except for with a handful of agencies. So what's interesting about what's going on today is they've so far been able to sidestep having arguments over the validity of the agencies, with the exception of USAID, which is a different topic. I did a whole video on it. That's the foreign aid organization. But it's all been about headcount and workforce reductions and waste, fraud, and abuse. And they've done this very, very successfully. Now, Musk, of course, has a huge history doing this practically in his companies. When he bought Twitter, now X, I think he reduced the workforce by 75%. And if you're an X user, you probably have no idea that that ever happened because the product hasn't really changed. Just a lot of the internal mechanisms to create that product have changed, culling a lot of people out of the process. But the product itself, the outlay, the output of Twitter hasn't really changed all that much. What Musk, I believe, is trying to do is to reduce headcount in a lot of these agencies to the point where they can continue providing the value that they're statutorily required to provide without a consumer or a taxpayer really noticing the difference of the sausage making that's happening between getting the money from the federal government and making those outlays for whatever program. So I'm giving a lot of thought to this, and if you're in the private sector, you know that culling workforce is something that just happens all the time. It happens most tightly at the small business level, less in terms of layoffs or firing people, and more in terms of just keeping a very, very tight view of headcount. I can tell you that I'm a small business owner. I have 22 employees at our mental health clinic down in Woodbridge, and I've been putting off hiring a full-time admin person. I would like to do this, but I know that if I do that, it's going to be money that's out of my pocket. Now, I may be saving myself some time in order to do that, but the point is that small business owners, because they're so directly tied to the bottom lines of their businesses, make very, very careful hiring decisions. But once an enterprise gets over about $20 million and there's less direct impact from the owner or the equity holder over specific hiring decisions, you start to see bloat happen. Because it's no longer the business owner who's making the hiring decisions, it's department heads. It's like an internal bureaucracy within an organization. And one of the things that happens is that once managers realize that this bloat is happening, that they have too many heads for the output that they're required to create, they will periodically do culls or rifts or layoffs in order to thin down their workforce. One of the reasons why they do it as layoffs or rifts is because it's very difficult in the litigiousness of American society today to fire people for cause. Very difficult to do that. About 3% of terminations for cause end up in lawsuits, and nobody wants a lawsuit. So these companies periodically will lay off numbers of people at the same time, and that protects them legally from lawsuits if it's done as part of a RIF as opposed to a one-off termination. But that is one of the ways practically that companies get rid of low-performing or toxic staff. It's a strategy that CFOs do. It's actually one of the core competencies of a CFO is to be able to look at headcount and figure out ways to reduce it periodically. Now, once you get to a large company, none of the jobs that are not core to the output of the company are ever safe. So I used to work in the automotive industry. So if you look at like Ford or GM, periodically they'll have huge layoffs, not really at the manufacturing side, although sometimes they have to idle a factory. It's usually within the bureaucracy of the company itself, right? So would I want either my two sons or daughters to work at an automotive company? No, unless you were like a senior person working at the assembly line where you're kind of really needed, or maybe if you were like the top engineer and your work is required to create the cars. But my gosh, to have like a mid-level marketing position or a mid-level admin position at General Motors, my gosh, that's the last job I would ever want because it's always at risk of being cut once the company is facing some financial ills and they have to figure out how to save money. So when you go to the federal government, I went from small, medium, large companies. Once you go to the federal government, like you're just taking this to a completely different level because there is no equity holder, not really, it's us, the taxpayers, but we're like so many steps removed from hiring. We're not even anywhere near that, right? And then the other thing that happens is that workforce reductions just generally aren't required at the federal government. I mean, there were some workforce reductions in the 90s when President Clinton was squaring off against the Republicans in Congress. There were some, in the early 2010s when the Republicans were facing off against Obama, although that had more to do with stopping new hiring and then freezing compensation. But this type of periodic culling of unproductive or toxic staff just does not really happen at the federal workforce level. I can give an example of how this might work in practice. So, there are all these different big, U.S. departments, education, energy, transportation, and then there are lots of little sub-departments themselves of which you might spend $900 million a year and report up to an agency that spends $100 billion a year, right? So there's many, many steps removed. And so an example would be like you take a small, obscure agency in the U.S. Department of Transportation. There was a crash of a Cessna airplane a couple of days ago. So suppose somebody at the White House, somebody at the Department of Transportation says, hey, the little department in transportation that oversees general aviation needs to run a public safety marketing campaign. All right, go out and do it. Now, in order to run that campaign, they have to hire a vendor, but then they also have to hire or bring on additional staff to manage that initiative for a period of time. What happens is that initiative doesn't go on forever, but once those 3 staff are locked into that budget, the manager of that budget doesn't want to give those staff up because they want to have the flexibility to be able to have people on their staff. Nobody wants to work too much, right? So they end up in this self-interested mode of protecting all of the people on their staff. And because there's no cost-cutting pressures like there are in the small, medium, large businesses, those jobs end up just sitting there forever, whether they're productive or not. And when you multiply those 3 employees who might be getting paid $100,000 a year, by the way, plus another 40% of federal, workforce comp with all the benefits and the great healthcare plan and the retirement packages, suppose it's $150,000 average for those 3 employees, $450,000 per year. You multiply that across 1,000 agencies times 10 years, you're talking about tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars that could be saved. There's 2.5 million non-military people in the federal workforce. I suspect that you could probably cut, in many agencies, not all, but in many agencies, I suppose that I suspect that you could cut many of these departments by at least 10% without having any impact on the measurable output of the agency, what the agency was actually created for. You could cut those positions in the general aviation sub-department of transportation without having an impact on what that agency is supposed to do, on the output of that agency. And when you basically scale that to all of the government agencies, there really is tons of savings to be had. And what Musk has been able to do so far is to sidestep these questions about the validity of the departments and their output and focus more on waste, fraud, and abuse, which I think everyone, except for the most partisan progressive, knows goes on. And where the rubber is really going to hit the road is where you have the Republican bureaucracy, which is in the Pentagon, right? The Pentagon is by far the largest corporation in the world, and they don't do layoffs. So that I can't even imagine how much waste, fraud, and abuse is in the Pentagon budget. And that is a way for Musk and Trump to prove their bona fides that this is a government-wide thing. We're not just sticking it to the left-wing government programs. We're also actually we're going to do this to defense too, because there is a ton of personnel and different projects going on in the Pentagon that could be absolutely 100% culled back, reined in, without anyone noticing any difference with regard to true preparedness or readiness for conflict and wars and that type of thing. So I'm cautiously, I know a lot of the media has been negative, but it hasn't trickled down to the polls so far. People are saying, well, it's Trump doing what he said he was going to do. I'm cautiously optimistic that they can actually cut back many of these agencies without taxpayers or people who receive the benefits of these agencies really noticing anything. If they're able to cut staffing at the Department of Health and Human Services without cutting Medicare or Medicaid outlays, that's a huge win. It's a huge win for everybody. Strengthens the budget, strengthens the dollar, doesn't impact the people who need Medicare and Medicaid. It will impact government employees that found themselves in positions that weren't core to the mission of those agencies. But again, that's the type of thing that needs to be done periodically. And over time, maybe we can find new places for the productive people in that crew to be able to work in different agencies. So that's my view of what's going on with DOGE. Would love to open up and talk to you guys about it some more. So drop a comment. Let me know what you think. Thanks. Take care.